After the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Japanese forces invaded the Philippines with little opposition. They took over most of the South China Sea islands, except for one called Corregidor. The small Corregidor Island is located at the entrance of Manila Bay, known as the finest harbor in the Orient. With its mixed and underpowered garrison, the island was the only obstruction that prevented the Japanese from having total control of the Philippines. American soldiers, Marines, Navy personnel, and the remains of improvised and locally trained Philippine units would strengthen the 4th Marine Regiment to fight back the Japanese invaders. Known as the Gibraltar of the East, Corregidor Island and its World War I-era fortifications resisted 5 intense months of continuous Japanese bombardments. But after the fall of Bataan in April of 1942, the Japanese Special Landing Forces turned to Corregidor for one more implacable coordinated attack. General Masaharu Hama and more than 50,000 Japanese forces stormed the Corregidor beaches and encircled the vastly outnumbered Allied troops in the area. A brutal battle for control of the island erupted. Japan goes to war. During World War II, Japanese forces embarked on a mission to take over the Southwest Pacific area. The Philippines, China, Vietnam, Korea, New Zealand, and Australia were all at risk. The British Empire was at war with the Third Reich, and it was losing the fight against the unstoppable and relentless Wehrmacht. The United States needed to get involved in preventing total Japanese domination. In March of 1941, the US and the United Kingdom elaborated a plan that anticipated the Americans' entry into the war. Rainbow 5 called for a defensive strategy in the Pacific until Germany was defeated. The plan left Wake Island, Guam, and the Philippines highly vulnerable to Japanese attacks while the Americans fought in Europe and Africa. But recently appointed commander of the US Army Air Forces in the Far East, General Douglas MacArthur, was confident that the US could control the entire Philippine archipelago if a war against Japan broke out. Only about 12,000 Philippine scouts were ready for battle, so MacArthur's plan called for the training of more than 100,000 Filipinos to assemble a proper army. The ambitious plan was eventually altered in the summer of 1941, as General Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, and General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, opted to send 35 destructive B-17 flying fortresses to protect the Pacific Seas instead of training the Filipinos. Marshall blindly believed that the B-17s could single-handedly wreak havoc in the ranks of the Japanese Imperial Navy, but he underestimated the enemy at a significant cost. On December 8, 1941, Japanese forces simultaneously attacked Pearl Harbor, Thailand, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. In a matter of hours, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft destroyed what Marshall had previously called, quote, the greatest concentration of heavy bomber strength anywhere in the world. The Japanese air forces wrecked the 35 B-17 bombers, and the American fleet was reduced to ashes before it could even put up a fight. Soon, the Japanese Special Landing Forces had taken Luzon, Mindanao, and the Ligayan Gulf. Only the Bataan Peninsula and the small island of Corregidor were left standing. The fate of the Pacific Theater now rested on the shoulders of less than 10,000 men. The Gibraltar of the East. The island of Corregidor, known as Fort Mills after the Spanish-American War of the late 19th century, was the largest of 4 fortified islands that protected the entrance to Manila Bay, a natural harbor strategically positioned around the capital city of the Philippines. When the United States occupied the Philippines after the conflict with Spain, they embarked on the construction of defensive fortifications to protect the archipelago. By the time World War II blew up, the stronghold was finished. The Americans were so proud of their defenses in Corregidor that they used to call it the Gibraltar of the East, or the Rock. Mounted behind concrete barbettes in open pits, the structures included 56 coastal guns and mortars, 28 anti-aircraft guns, and more than 40 50-caliber machine guns. The resources mainly were pre-World War I equipment, but the island was well equipped. Corregidor only had one significant weakness. During its construction phase, air warfare was non-existent, and the island was highly vulnerable to air attacks. Once the enemy could get past the horizontal defensive barriers, every man and structure was exposed to bombardments. Only the extensive tunnel system that ran underneath the island could serve as shelter. These tunnels were connected to 3 fortresses known as Fort Drum, Fort Hughes, and Fort Frank. General MacArthur eventually set up his personal headquarters in the area, but Lieutenant General Masahiro Homa, the commander in charge of the 14th Japanese Imperial Army, was eager to end the American resistance around the Bataan Peninsula and the island of Corregidor. Blockade. On December 29, 1941, Japanese forces bombarded the island of Corregidor. It was the first of around 300 bombing raids that would subjugate the 4-mile-long and 1.5-mile-wide fortified island. The bombardments became a daily routine. Buildings and resources were heavily damaged, and the resisting Allied forces became increasingly demoralized. In March of 1942, General MacArthur left Corregidor under the cover of darkness. He left behind a controversial order for all the men in Bataan and Corregidor. It read, quote, "No further retreat is possible. We have more troops in Bataan than the Japanese have thrown against us. It is a question now of courage and determination. Men who run will merely be destroyed, but men who fight will save themselves and their country. I call upon every soldier in Bataan to fight in his assigned position, resisting every attack. This is the only road to salvation. If we fight, we will win. If we retreat, we will be destroyed." By April 9th, the Bataan Peninsula fell to the Japanese. Meanwhile, Corregidor had suffered a tremendous impact on its landscape. The once beautiful foliage that covered the island was now gone. The rock was nothing more than sand, bomb craters, scattered trees, and the battered concrete defenses. Lieutenant General Homa had wanted to overtake Corregidor in a full 2 months, but the island resisted 5 months of continuous bombardment. By May 4th, he launched an ambitious 50,000-men amphibious operation to finally occupy the island. The battle. The 4th Marine Regiment was composed of units from the U.S. Army and Navy and strengthened by a militia of Filipinos. They totaled 13,000 men who had been living with around 30 ounces of food per day for the last few months. Japan's General Homa chose the 4th Marines East Sector to perform the initial assault. The U.S. Marines had already noticed that the Japanese had concentrated their artillery barrages in the region. The regiment reinforced the surrounding area and waited for the Japanese to make a landing. At about 10 p.m. on May 5th, an unforgiving artillery barrage rained upon the entire island, and the Japanese approached the coast aboard barges. The U.S. Marines heard the motors coming from the north, east, and south shores. For the first time after the siege had begun 5 months before, face-to-face combat was imminent. The Japanese forces shot down searchlights that the Marines had placed to track bombers. The attack was brutal and relentless. The first Japanese landing waves were obliterated by the brave resistance put up by the Marines and Filipinos. Using the few hand grenades and 37mm shells on hand, the defenders withstood as many Japanese soldiers as they could. But the Allied forces were soon overwhelmed with additional Japanese reinforcements. After several hours of intense combat, the Marines and soldiers pulled back and headed inland. The shores were covered with fallen men, and the beginning of the end was imminent. At 2 in the morning, the Allied forces launched a counterattack to retake Denver Battery on the island's north side. Close-quarters combat within the island's concrete structures followed. Soldiers fought with bayonets, knives, and in individual duels. It was a sight right out of the Great War. By 4 a.m., Japanese snipers began picking off targets from afar. The Americans and Filipinos took cover while the enemy infantry advanced to encircle them. The entire island was now surrounded, and ammunition was running short. At 9:30 a.m., Japanese tanks landed on the island, and the remaining defenders retreated to the Malinta Tunnel's main entrance. They found more than 3,000 wounded and unarmed men lying there. Commander General Jonathan Wainwright realized that if the Japanese broke through the tunnel, a massacre would ensue. The Japanese would show no mercy to the thousands of wounded men. He had to surrender. Wainwright then sent a radio message to President Franklin Roosevelt saying, quote, "There is a limit of human endurance, and that point has long been passed." The 4th Marine Regiment's flag and the American flag were burned. At 2 p.m. on May 6, 1942, Wainwright sent a group of officers carrying a white flag to signal their surrender to the Japanese. General Homa's emissaries let Wainwright know that the Japanese would not accept his surrender unless he told every single soldier in the Philippines to back down and cease fire. When Wainwright hesitated, the Japanese dropped 88 tons of bombs on top of the surrendered troops. He finally gave in and sent a message to his officers scattered all over the region. The troops obeyed with some resignation. After 5 months of intense bombardments and 2 days of hand-to-hand combat, the defeat was imminent, and the battle on the Rock came to an end. The occupation of Corregidor foretold the fall of the Philippines and Asia. It was soon followed by the battle for New Guinea and Guadalcanal, marking a turning point in the Pacific War. Survivors of the ordeal would forever be proud to be called Corregidor Marines. American and Filipino forces would only be able to recapture the island fortress until February of 1945.